All right, I think we can start. Well, first of all, welcome to the fourth webinar of IPRM's webinar series. Today we take a look at structured content authoring as an efficient approach to document management. Just like Michaeli has put it well, many of you may be familiar with structured content authoring. However, few may really know what it is and what it can do. First, a little introduction. My name is L.Zhu. I am consultant and marketing lead at IPRM Life Sciences Consultancy, and I will be coordinating today's webcast for you. We have two speakers today. Our main speaker is L.Zhu, with more than 18 years of experience in the life sciences industry. He is an IDMP subject matter expert and has recently taken on the role as IRIS IDMP topic lead. Our second speaker is our topic expert, Sarah Berdijs. Sarah has worked with IDMP since 2015 with key focus on data and process improvements with hands-on experience on structured content authoring within the IDMP landscape. So for those of you that are new to IPRM's webinar series, it was an initiative initiated last October where a series of webinars took place addressing the key questions concerning RIM business implementation, IDMP, and ERP RIM integration. For those that have missed the previous webinars, do kindly drop a note to the organizer if you do wish to have a look at the available webinar materials. So as for today, we'll take a look into structured content authoring, as already mentioned, and in our final webinar, we will illustrate how all previous discussion points can be brought together to facilitate an integrated way of information management and the benefits of doing so. So the structure of today's session is as follows. First, Fritz will provide an introduction of structured content authoring as one of the use cases for process improvement and data interoperability. Next, Sarah will illustrate a few practical examples where structured content authoring can be used. Fritz then will close the session with the key steps required for successful implementation of structured content authoring. So to make this session more interactive, we have included two polls, and each poll will take a few minutes, and once the poll is complete, the poll result will be shared with you immediately. So for that, I would highly appreciate your participation. And of course, if any questions do arise during the webcast, do kindly send them over via the chat function, and we will address them at the end if time allows. And with that said, I would like to give the floor to Fritz first.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the introduction, Lunyen. My name is L.Zhu. I'm responsible for our IDMP consulting practice as IPRM Life Sciences Consultancy, but also involved in several other topics, and one of them is the IRIS topic group. Speaking of the IRIS topic group, and speaking of IRIS in general, many of you may have joined an IRIS webinar recently that we actually provided on structured content authoring to the entire IRIS community. There will be some overlap with the things that we've done there. However, you learn every day, and therefore these slides have evolved from that. And what we will try to do is to give you a view on how technology like structured content authoring, which is often a very container term, and therefore very difficult for people to fully understand what does it mean and how do I put it in practice. It's also not just one thing, there are many interpretations. But what we would like to do today is to show you, for one, how it contributes to the overall thinking of exchangeability, interoperability of data. From the first picture that you were shown by Lunyen, maybe we can go back to that slide for a moment, where we see the different topics from our webinars come together. It is our belief, and I don't think we're the only ones, that our industry is in heavy need of exchangeable data. We have a knowledge and data intensive industry, and actually the people that use the outputs of our industry, which in, of course, initial cases are regulators, but further down the line, of course, patients, healthcare providers, the public in general, is all very knowledge and data intensive. Our products are often complex. They have many characteristics that may also change based on scientific research that's being done, or even things we find from the market. So overall, the management of our information on our products is just as important as the actual management of our products. And we see various dimensions on doing this. For one, of course, we have the regulatory side on those products, and then often something like RIMS is mentioned. And we see, of course, how the ISO IDMP standards have expanded on the typical RIMS scope that we've been looking at over the previous 10 years. We also see that, of course, regulatory plays a huge role in describing the product that can go on the market, which means that our colleagues on the supply chain and the logistics side need to be able to produce and distribute and, of course, release that product, which makes it more and more important to exchange the information in a suitable format with those colleagues. And that's where a topic like ERP RIMS exchange is important, which we described in our webinar number 3. Webinar number 4, which is today, is a good example in our view of, are there technologies that can help us in this knowledge and information intensive industry to make this easier? As you will know, and then I would like to go to the next slide, my first slide of the deck, we are a very document intensive industry. Why is this? Is it legacy? Is it history? Do we love paper? Well, for one, I think most of our experts, both on the side of the industry, but certainly also on the side of the receiving regulator, love their contents, and for good reason. This content determines very strongly the effectiveness, but also the safety of our products. Those documents have been defined extensively, and we all spend a lot of time on the exact definition of those documents. And for example, now ECTD4, the many templates that are out there, and they are still document templates. If you look at the current world, then a lot of the flow of information is data. And for a very understandable reason, of course, data can be much better migrated from one to the other. You can use different formats. And also the reporting across data is much easier. But for that, of course, you need standards. So if we look at the current situation, then yes, documents play a bigger role in the area that we're looking at than data does. Especially if you look at the actual submission of a product, a new product, the change of a product, a variation, then a lot of that information is shared in documents. We see, of course, a nice example by XEVMPD in Europe, where we see a data submission on top of documents. But I think we can honestly say that XEVMPD, unfortunately, has not been the most elegant example of using data on top of documents. And many of us had hoped that IDMP, perhaps even SPOR in the EMA context, would make an upgrade of that situation, and we believe it will, but unfortunately it's taking a bit more time. So overall, what do we see? We see transition, because the world is screaming for this data. It's not just the public that wants a quicker and a more accessible version of our product information, but it's also that regulator. That regulator needs that information in a different style so they can make quicker decisions and perhaps even quicker evaluations, which of course is one of the key reasons for industry to want this. So we see a transition coming where data might even overtake documents. And why not? The majority of the information in our dossiers is very suitable for exchange as information. And of course, again, this is where a topic like ISO IDMP plays a very significant role. It is a challenging migration, of course, because all our systems, all our thinking, all our processes are based on documents. And migrating from documents to data, for one, it either requires heavy investment in all sorts of databases based on, for example, IDMP and no longer using documents. But I think we all know that that jump is way too far. There is no way we can manage that securely. And then one of the ways of doing this in a typical transition period is to make a hybrid between the way of documents and the way of data. And a typical example in our view is structured content authoring. There are many ways of doing structured content authoring, and we'll come back to this a little bit later. But you can see that for one, you could feed documents through information systems. You can also identify in documents which parts are information that you actually want to capture in data sets. Data sets could be in systems, but could also be part of submissions. So We are, of course, aware of the fact that documents are not going to disappear. I also think documents don't need to disappear. And therefore, they will always form a baseline, and probably a higher baseline than data ever did, in our industry. And that's just a matter of fact, and that's also not a problem. And especially structured content authoring could build a very nice bridge between the two. So how does that fit in our overall view? Next slide, please. We have this slide, which we've shared in other webinars as well. And this is our view on what's happening. It's not rocket science, because there are many smart people out there, but it is our view on what's happening. So we've moved from electronic paper, PDF, which didn't always give us that much more benefits besides not having to print and using maybe less trees, but it didn't give us a data set. If we move to number 2, then we're moving much more to a data source. So no longer just electronic paper, but we move to a data source. But it is a single dot, as you can see. It supports one silo, and in that silo we manage the data the best we can. However, we of course know that other silos in our industry, or even outside of our companies, need that information as well. And so the need arises to share with other parts of the company or outside, and then you get point-to-point exchanges of structured data. Or at least we're hoping it's structured data. And then, of course, it's really important that we have the same definition of that structured data. And of course, in phase 3, you'll get a lot of development to make sure that you have the same definition. If we go to step number 4, then we really recognize that it's not just 2 items that need this, 2 silos that want to exchange, but many. And to allow that to happen in an efficient way with the same definitions, you almost need a broker in the middle. And that broker is typically master data management. So you set a number of standards, sometimes coming from external, like ISO IDMP, but you also manage the content of all the master data. So data that's shared amongst those different silos. This, of course, is for some the Valhalla, so the ultimate thing we want to go for. And of course, it has a lot of complexity. Doesn't always mean you have to do all silos at once. You can certainly find use cases to address that. Structured content authoring can be a way of achieving that easier because it allows you to do a hybrid. It still allows you to use documents, and slowly you are identifying which information comes from systems, which information actually comes from documents but goes into systems, and how you deal with that. Next slide, please. You might think that we're trying to convince you to do structured content authoring. Well, for one, we enjoy the topic, and yes, we support several companies as an agnostic consultancy company in doing this, implementing it, sometimes assessing it, but it should always be your choice. There are different situations at different companies, or even different regulators, and the scales are not always tipped on the positive side. It really depends. So if we take a typical list of arguments, then we would find something like this. We are, of course, a heavily regulated industry, which means it makes a lot of sense to take this information under strict control. There is a large amount of documents, which of course have a lot of relations to other documents, like translations, a very important topic. And that could be another reason for addressing this with a more automated tool. We do a lot of manual authoring of documents, which of course is labor intensive, and reusing information across several documents, like mentioned in the next one, is another good reason for one, efficiency, but two, consistency of the information that you publish is highly important. I would almost say it can introduce a liability if you don't. And finally, you would like to do reporting on these documents. Now, reporting on documents is typically done by taking the information from those documents, but if you have a data set underlying those documents, it becomes a lot more feasible or even more efficient to do that. Now, that all sounds very nice if you're pro structured content authoring, but there are also quite a few reasons not to go into this adventure. We don't always know what structured content authoring is and what the possibilities are. And you could even ask, are all the tools out there, which aren't even that many, are they really using all those possibilities in the best way? Does it integrate with the rest of your environment? And of course, we are sometimes resistant as an industry to these new processes. And I think the fact that we have to do so much validation is a good reason for that. But furthermore, I think there have been bad experiences with a topic like this. And I do need to mention the PIM project from many years ago, which was very much related to structured content authoring. And of course, that gives a certain resistance or even skepsis. The initial investment to move towards structured content authoring is also significant. Furthermore, there is a migration, because your current documents do not have this underlying data set under it. So you will have to deal with that backlog. And finally, business cases are always hard, so it's not immediately obvious. This is where we'd like to get your opinion. So I'd like to hand over for a moment to Lunien. Maybe you can run the poll for us. So the question is, structured content authoring has the potential to change the way documents are managed in pharma. Do you agree to that? You have the following options. I don't agree. There are way too many challenges associated with this. I partly agree, but the awareness really has to be increased. Or you completely agree. This is the direction we need to head for. So let me know when we've completed the poll. Okay, so interesting. Nobody actually in this current group said that you don't agree, that you think that there are too many challenges. There are a highest number of you that's saying we partly agree, but there is a lot of awareness to be done. And there is 44%, which is a very significant portion, that really believes structured content authoring is the future. Now, of course, we've driven you into a certain direction because we're saying that the key issue is awareness. I could very well imagine that there are more issues. And I think in one of our upcoming webinars, or perhaps even via a forum question, we would like to dive in and find out what you think are the real obstacles in there. Because there is also technology, there is also the view from the regulators, etc., etc. Thank you for joining the poll. Let's go back to the slides. And I'll try not to restart from the beginning, otherwise it becomes very long. So we come back to the definition discussion. Do we all have the same understanding of structured content authoring? Now, this list is not the holy list, it is our list. And I think I would like to go through this and give you a view on what structured authoring is and can be. For one, it should include authoring of your documents in a controlled environment, where you might say, well, that's something I do in a document management environment anyway, which is true. But in this case, you should use a lot of metadata, which actually is also not necessarily exclusive for structured content authoring, as that also occurs in typical document management environments. You will use predefined templates, and it's starting to get more specific. You will assign metadata to specific contents in the document, and this is where things really start turning around. It means you start thinking in components, specific components, actually components that can have their own version. Furthermore, you might author your documents using pull-down lists with predefined CVs, controlled vocabularies. which basically means that on the creation of the document, you are also predetermining how to basically deal with the contents. If we look, of course, at developments like SPOR, where we see the RMS system in place, or even the OMS system, then having a predefined list of values for a specific field makes a lot of sense. It is actually master data management in its truest form. So let's take an example. If we have to describe the marketing authorization holder in a product information document, it would make sense if the value in there would always align to the official value of both the company, but of course the one we've just registered in OMS. And this is how things eventually should come together. Is it thereby needed that we start using an OMS identifier in our product information documents? I don't think we're that far yet, but it is a valid question. Finally, could you author documents using both CVs, but perhaps even contents coming from other systems? So could you populate directly the pull-down lists in your structured authoring environment through your RIMs, for example? Or could you even populate the information in your document with values, real values, coming from your RIMs, for example? And then more and more, we see that we're actually working with data, and documents are just a vehicle to publish them. Next slide, please. Now, if you've joined our RIMS webinar, then you may have seen that we try to make a typical, almost solution map, an overall set of characteristics in a number of dimensions that describes this topic. So we've tried to do the same for structured content authoring. So in our view, these 4 dimensions, process, content, data, and compliance and reporting, are very good dimensions to look at typical functionalities, or maybe I should say sometimes lack of functionalities, on structured content authoring. Well, if we look from a process point of view, these are all quite logical. And the first one, of course, is a very general remark. The overall lifecycle management of these documents is a key part of your process. And it is something you want this system to be capable of. In some cases, it might be that your structured content authoring solution is a more specific document management environment and not your overall document management environment. And then it needs to be capable to exchange the information on lifecycle management with your overall document management system. Translations, an important topic in our industry, but certainly also in product information. And therefore, managing the translations, including the consistency to the master version or the update thereof, is a key component that has a lot of effect on the efficiency of this process. And that includes, of course, version control. Version control on the document, but preferably we move more and more towards version control on the components that we have in our documents, perhaps even on the different language versions of those components. A good example is, of course, the use case on labeling, and doing end-to-end labeling, where you can really share the information in different formats between different systems that play a role there, is really important. Sarah will go into this topic in the second part of this webinar. If we look at content, then there are indeed different areas where you could apply the technology of structured content authoring. There is overall R&D documents management, which of course is a very general remark, but more specifically, you could look at dossier management, which includes label management, of course, but label management can go beyond dossier management, especially if we also look at the supply chain part of it. And finally, we've taken the example of quality document management. Many quality documents, SOPs, instructions, etc., will have common parts, will have very specific templates, and it could make a lot of sense to apply structured content authoring on them. This list is not complete, as you can see. There are more examples that we could give, and actually in the second part, Sarah will go into a few of them. If we look from a data perspective, we've mentioned controlled vocabularies, and it has a lot of power if you can use controlled vocabularies in your environment, because you can make sure that you use the common values, which also from a reporting point of view will give you a lot of benefit. The actual information on your licenses, which is really important, as this is a key asset to your organization. The information on organizations, I've mentioned OMS, and yes, values on used organization names is a very important list, a critical list, to check for consistency, and therefore having that list available as data would benefit you very strongly, certainly upon changes. Another great example is, of course, safety information that's held within typical documents like, for example, the label. Again, a very good example of information that you would want to share with other departments or perhaps even with regulators, and therefore having that available as data would make a lot of sense. The capability for a structured content authoring to share information like that, and perhaps even take this example to share the actual safety information with your safety system, your drug safety system, by pharmacovigilance, of course has a huge impact on the automation of these two silos. You can bring them more closely together, and you can make sure that you always work on the latest version of your product information. And then finally, a topic that will often be mentioned as the most important one actually, but yeah, we tend to disagree, compliance and reporting. You need to be capable of reporting many of these values. I think we all remember that with the initial XEVMPD exercise, it was all about the SPC. Basically, if you described your SMPC correctly in data, you would practically have your XEVMPD submission. So doing structured authoring, having that type of control over the information of your SMPC, could basically be a very good solution towards ongoing XEVMPD. Something similar we see in the US, of course, with SPL, and actually, considering that basically both are a subset of IDMP, it makes a lot of sense to apply structured content authoring on such documents to have a data version available for your products for IDMP submissions in due course. But external is only one reason for doing this, and the last two boxes are focused on internal requirements. For one, business reporting. If you really want to have grip on what type of documents you have and all different sorts of cross-sections across that information, then of course having a data version of these documents can allow you to do so. Furthermore, you could do reporting on the quality of the information in your documents. Have we spelled it correctly every time? Have we used the same terms? And you might even be capable of addressing a number of liabilities in your documents by doing that. So all in all, we see this list as a good example, not necessarily the complete list, but a good example of where structured content authoring can really drive you towards more control over the information that you share. Next slide, please. Now, this is a very nice picture, in my view, but it is an open door. The current situation is that we certainly use data sources. We've mentioned 3 departments, RA, pharmacovigilance, manufacturing. They make a lot of documents, and those documents basically have data in them, basically data for different systems, and we record that data into those different systems. That's usually the order in which we do things nowadays, which of course is always post hoc. So we always follow the document. The future, of course, could be much more interesting because we do our processes, and in those processes, we basically take data and have it in a source system, which we use in many ways. So for RA, that would typically be a RIMS. For PV, it would typically be the safety database. And manufacturing, amongst others, would use an ERP system, but perhaps also a labeling system. Those systems could populate relevant documents by publishing through structured content authoring. And one of the advantages, of course, is that you can really manage the consistency because you're using the values from your systems and it's not a duplicate. But furthermore, the system will get much closer to the process. And I think that's another key component that structured content authoring would allow you to achieve. Next slide, please. So, to bring it all together, do you get benefits from doing this? Because it all sounds very nice, but do I have to do it from a regulator point of view? And of course, the answer is no. So does it give me any real benefits? Well, we've put a number of examples in here. And of course, these things need to be shown in practice because they're still very high level, but we really believe that these things can be shown. And we've seen examples of those. Bridging those organizational silos, handing over information that you're responsible for to the next department that needs it, and thereby bringing those silos closer together. We've mentioned RA and PV, and it's a good example, which of course is an example of improved data interoperability, which in our view is the holy grail. Do you get improved document content quality and consistency? Well, in our experience, the answer is a very big yes, because the capability to look across the information of so many documents and to reuse master versions of descriptions, for example, coming from your CCDS across all relevant product information documents, has huge impact on the quality of your documents. Do you increase the effectiveness, the efficiency of your organization? Well, the answer is yes. It takes some time, of course, because this is an initial investment, but making sure that you have a master set of information that you can reuse across other documents, of course, has a lot of effect. It does, of course, take a change, because people will no longer just work in Microsoft Word and just basically do whatever they like and then put it into a document management system as versions. No, a structured content authoring tool requires you to work slightly differently. And that, of course, has some impact on the people that work in these documents directly. A single source of data. We change it once, we use it everywhere, which should also mean we have a reduced data duplication and therefore a reduced effort for maintenance. Overall, it should lead to consistent data throughout our documents and our systems. Next slide, please. Now, it's all been very general, but we would like to dive into 4 examples. Those 4 examples are the following: labeling and artwork, where of course we'd be looking at CCDS, SMPC, USPI, but also Japan PI, which hold typical information like clinical particulars and warnings. We are looking at CMC documentation, where of course the CTD Module 3 is important. I think the whole discussion in the US right now on PQ CMC is highly related to this, and it also holds, of course, relevant IDMP information. Examples include composition or even manufacturers, and the reuse, of course, of manufacturers towards OMS has great value. Clinical development, of course, from an IDMP perspective, far less clear, because we all say that iteration 2 is far, it's not happening for a while, but nevertheless, the concepts are the same. Managing the content of your investigator's brochure or your IMPD has a lot of value, and as a matter of fact, the sponsor is being tracked in OMS already, so it's already a good example. And managing the actual values that apply on your investigational product has a lot of value for your compliance. And finally, another example is applying the same technology and concepts on your quality documents, where of course tasks and roles are nice examples of information that you would like to keep consistent across those different documents. I would like to hand over to Sarah from this point, because this is where she will dive into some of the details on these 4 elements, and I'll be back for the conclusion. I think Sarah is still on mute. Can we arrange that?
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. That's much better.
Perfect. All right. So let's start from the beginning. Thank you very much, Fritz. So as he already mentioned, I'd like to give you a more detailed view on 2 of the use cases that he mentioned. The first one is the labeling use case, and the second one is the use case for CMC documentation supported by structured content authoring. Next slide, please. So Fritz also explained that product information documents share a lot of the same data. Think of all the indications, side effects, but also standard tags like warnings. And these similarities in these documents are present on 2 levels. First one is within the same type of documents, for example, SMPC for a similar product, or SMPC for the same product but registered in a different country. Secondly, the similarities also appear within different types of documents. Example is a CCDS and SMPC which should have the same indications captured. So what does that mean practically? People responsible for writing of these documents, of course, need to manually type the same information several times in several different documents. We all know that. And if the information changes due to variation, for example, the process is the same. Locate all the documents within this, all the documents with this information, and type in the updated version several times, of course. Now the question here comes, how can that potentially change with structured content authoring? On the slide, you will see there are depicted two different potential source systems with the information that we find in the product information documents. The first one, this is safety database, and the second one, clinical trial database. As previously mentioned, it is also key that with using structured content authoring, we define the data sources with high quality of data, as this will of course be our input for the documents. So when we define the source data, we also need to define which documents need this data. In this picture, that is CCDS, SMPC, and USPI, for example. Of course, we also need to define for which product or products and which countries this data applies to. So by using the main principle of structured content authoring, that is the population of documents from data, we automatically distribute the data from source systems to applicable document scope. What does that bring? So as mentioned already before by Fritz, it ensures alignment of data between the documents. It also therefore facilitates any comparison between different product information documents across countries and maybe even compared to CCDS. Due to already previously structured data used in these documents, it also supports compliance reporting, for example, IDMP and clinical particulars, but I will explain that on the next slide. So I'm not going to mention all the benefits, but I do want to point out one more here, and that is the change in the point where decisions are made in the whole authoring process. So instead of making important decisions about wording of a certain data element at the end of authoring, so let's say just before document submission to health authorities, the decisions are made and agreed upon at the beginning of the process. So the only thing that's left is for the system to propagate that to all the documents, and that I think it's a nice example of how organization can become much more effective. Next slide, please. So one of my first experiences with the structured content authoring was actually due to IDMP, as already mentioned by Lonian at the beginning. I think clinical particulars are a great example of how structured content authoring can lower the operational efforts associated with capture and maintenance of these elements. And that is, of course, for internal purposes, but also in the future, external submission processes for IDMP. If you look at the slide, the first part of the slide, I think you will all recognize the terrifying hand indicating the manual intervention. So we take a document, we find the data that we need, and we manually enter it into a database or even a spreadsheet. And if we press a fast forward button here, we submit this data as a part of the IDMP submission for the product. Or maybe to keep it more in the present, submit it in the EVMPD message. The second part of the slide depicts a very simplified way of looking at the described process, and this time by using structured content authoring principle. Also, as you might notice, there is no picture of the data source system prior to the document as depicted in one of the previous slides. The reason is that this actually describes a very early stage of structured content authoring and what we like to call it a hybrid approach. We use the document as the main source and we tag the specific part of text or specific data element. With this tag, we basically add another layer of data on top of document, and this layer represents the structured data. This data can be then distributed over several other documents and can be exchanged with other systems or authorities. Any updates to this specific tagged information works similar as the full structured content authoring principle. In case there is an update to the clinical particular tagged within this document, the item gets automatically updated in all documents that are connected to this particular document. So when Fritz explained at the beginning that the functionalities of the structured content authoring tool depend on your scope and drivers, this example, I think, supports just that. It is not a representation of the full structured content authoring, but can be used as the first stage. Next slide, please. So the second use case I want to explain is the structuring of CMC documentation. And I want to link this to the draft PQ-CMC standard and only use it as an example area where structured authoring could potentially play a role. Now, no need to explain. Module 3, I think we all know, is very much suited for standardization, and manufacturers and composition are just two of the topics where free text probably has very little involvement. So what we did on this slide, we took the draft PQ-CMC standard and tried to map it to two of the modules and its topic to show where standardization can take place. It is not conclusive or final, but it does confirm my previous statement of Module 3 standardization. And any document that can be standardized to a certain extent is a candidate for structured content authoring, in our opinion. Next slide, please. So to make this a bit more visual and practical, I'd like to briefly walk you through how we think standards for CMC data, like the FDA's proposed PQ-CMC standard, could be used to apply structured authoring to Module 3 data. So firstly, we have here an assumption that FDA would require both structured data files and traditional format to be submitted. And the idea is that underlying data, which eventually needs to be submitted, is captured in the RIMS database. So it serves as a source of this data. This data is then converted into the SPL file. And furthermore, the style sheet is applied to the structured data, which provides formatting, for example. Now, both these together, content coming from SPL and formatting coming from the style sheet, can be automatically combined, and the traditional CTD module format can be generated. Therefore, there's an option of having SPL and or CTD submitted to authorities, in this case, FDA. Also, something important to note is that this slide depicts the principle of structured authoring and not the actual tool, as of course RIMS database would normally be outside of the tool and is integrated with the tool itself. Another thing it shows is the possibility of actually separating the content from context and focusing on the part that is arguably more important, and that is the actual content. Next slide, please. So the principle I just explained is, of course, not specific to the US market. If we look at the applicability in Europe, I want to use the organizations managed in EMA's OMS as an example. There are several places this information is captured, and I think at least 3 we can see on this slide. So organizations captured within OMS, RIMS, and of course the documents. And traditionally, documents could be seen as the golden source. Data is extracted from these documents and captured in RIMS and then aligned with OMS system. But to switch it around with structured content authoring, this of course changes. We define the golden source to be the system. In this case, we use the RIMS, and then in RIMS, data is already structured and of high quality. Data is of course also exchanged with OMS as depicted with the arrows. So as explained in the previous slide, the principle is the same. Data in RIMS is used to build an SPL file, and by applying the style sheet, CTD documents can be automatically generated. So what we see now is that there is, of course, no more just one authority, but several of them, FDA and EMA. And what we also see that there are several ways to submit this data or documents to authorities. So traditional with CTD documents, or structured through OMS, which is both depicted on the upper side of the slide with the arrows. So even though the authorities might not fully support submission of structured data yet, structured content authoring actually supports both. So benefits of structured authoring in this approach can be seen either now, so with submissions of documents only, but also in the future when maybe submissions will be based only on structured data. With that, I would like to close off the use case presentation and give the word to Fritz to explain how to approach the whole structured content authoring implementation.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So it still is a very big elephant, and an elephant typically is eaten in slices. So let's look at some of the approaches that you could do that. These are our views. Next slide, please. So we've tried to make a number of steps, and then we regularly use the same dimensions, which are information, organization, process, and technology. And of course, if we look at information, in this case, it is very much about documents and the actual information that you want. We would look at the typical departments and the governance related to that. We would look at the processes where this plays a role and how can you adapt them to this new way of working and thinking. And finally, you need to have a solution to do this. It doesn't come automatically. So let's take a run through these topics. Next slide, please. Well, I think if we look at the actual information, now of course we recognize that there are different types of information in our documents. There is a document scope, even a document title. There is template alignment. That is a key concept of this way of working. But also we have these light blue areas in there which hold actual data. It holds alignment with a number of data standards, and good examples are, of course, IDMP, PQCMC, but also CDISC. And at the same time, there's format. Format on that data, where use of controlled vocabularies is important, but also the standardization of text. Understanding where this information comes from and what the golden source is very important in that. Next slide, please. Looking at the organization, it is something that you have to take into account. The information, of course, is being used by multiple departments, and you can see different examples being mentioned here, which includes regulatory affairs, labeling, and artwork, but also pharmacovigilance. And at the same time, this information is being shared through a system like this, which means people need to get used to that. There is change management involved in there, so people are trained and know how to use it. And then you can apply this information to other departments. If we look at the governance, this is something you need to set up. And this new way of working requires a different view on your governance, especially looking at the controlled vocabularies. So all in all, organization is an important topic to take into your approach and address. Next slide, please. If you look at the actual process, then we've already mentioned that data sources may now be able to fill your information in your documents through the source systems. That has an immediate impact on your way of working. It changes it. It does mean, of course, that the data quality in your source system might increase, but it also has requirements on the data quality of your source systems. And in some cases, of course, we see that documents were always reviewed so perfectly we could make sure that the content was correct, and then we would make sure that systems would follow. And of course, as soon as you start using systems to populate your documents, the actual requirement of data quality goes up. Change control of your process of your data in source systems and documents needs to be aligned, because right now that often is slightly different. And furthermore, there are a number of supporting processes like internal reporting, sometimes even QC, but certainly also the comparison, that really help you in using the full potential of structured content authoring. But in my view, those are also examples of really starting to use interoperable data in your organization. Next slide, please. Finally, technology. Now, we've put the map in here because we think those are good descriptions of what you should typically expect or even want from systems. And on the other hand, we've put a typical implementation scheme there, which includes or has a lot of focus on a V model, on a validated approach towards doing this, but also includes software selection. It is highly important that you make a choice on the areas in the solution map that are most important for you at this moment and in the upcoming future. And based on that, look at your software selection. We have a lot of experience in helping companies in determining what are your most important requirements and how do you describe them correctly to allow for a proper software selection. Doing this wrong, taking the wrong approach in here, of course, gives a lot of trouble in the later phases. But even if you do this well, there are still many challenges in making sure that you apply these systems in the right way, have them validated, and that they connect to the relevant other systems that play a role. And therefore, that is a very important topic. Don't underestimate the migration. Like we mentioned before, this can very often take quite some time, but has a lot of benefits across the globe if you are a global company. And finally, there is maintenance. But we are changing a way of working in the primary process. So we are not always moving the maintenance from, let's say, the authors of the documents to anyone else. We're training the authors to work in a new way. And that means that the user-friendliness of the system that you choose is an important criterion for making this successful. All in all, and I'd like the next slide for that, we feel that structured content authoring is a real change in thinking and really drives you towards interoperable data. It's a great use case for bridging those organizational silos and increasing the organizational effectiveness by applying document management in relation to this data interoperability. It does rely on having your basic information under control and at high quality, managing your organization and your process, but also looking at the technology that can help you in there. And finally, that really focuses on having the data standards, which is a separate topic by itself, always guaranteeing that your source data systems are recognized, governed, and that the data quality is at the right level, which also applies to your documents. And I think a key concept is that you have overall management and operational buy-in to allow for all this. It should fit into your strategy to make the step toward the future, which is not compliance driven, that's just a nice side effect, but will turn your organization into a much more data-driven entity instead of a document-driven entity. I hope this has been useful for you. I will give back to Lunyen. And of course, there is another webinar coming and she will explain about that. And of course, at any time, if you feel you are interested in this topic and would like to continue this conversation, feel free to contact us. Lunyen?
Thank you first for that. I think we still have one poll question left over. So we're just going to quickly launch it. First, you want to elaborate a little?
Yeah, that's fine. So let's look at the awareness of structured content authoring and its benefits within the group and area that you're working in, or even the company that you're working in. And you can select from, no, there is no awareness. Perhaps a few individuals are the exception. There is basic awareness of the principles and the benefits, but there's no buy-in yet. Or there's high awareness, even on the technology, and we are about to implement something like that. We'd be interested in your feedback.
Okay, I don't see any more answers coming in, so we're going to close the poll right now.
Okay, let's look at the results. So we have a tie. A shared first place is on no awareness, just a few individuals. There is awareness of the principles and the benefits, but there's no buy-in yet. And there's only 14%, which is perhaps even higher than I sometimes expected, where there is a high awareness and that you're actively looking at steps to be taken. For me, it shows that this topic is something that still needs a lot of explanation. It still needs a lot of clarification. And one of the ways to achieve that, of course, is to do proof of concepts. And I think that is what the industry is screaming for, preferably together with a number of regulators, to show in practice that this can be applied and has value to all of us. With that, I'd like to close. I look forward to continuing any conversations with you, and I'll hand over for the last few slides to Lunyan. Thank you.
All right, thank you both for that. If you have any questions, now is the time to send them over, and I will give you a little bit update on the next webinar. For some reason, the slides are frozen. All right, here we go. Anyways, for the next webinar, as we already previously mentioned, we're going to look at integrated information management, particularly the role each previous discussion topics play a role in the integrated approach of information management. And this webinar will take place on 20th of February. And for those who would like to register at the moment, you will see the registration link coming back. And so far, I do not see any questions coming in, so I hope everything was clear for you. Thank you again, Fritz and Sarah, for today's session. For our attendees, thank you very much for your attention and the active participation in the polls. So I hope this was useful. As usual, you will all be informed once the webinar materials is available. With that said, I would like to close this webcast, and I hope you all have a very nice rest of the day. Thank you.